And now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. It's Reformation Sunday, you've worn red, and really it's the birthday of the Lutheran Church. More about Reformation and birthdays in a moment, and Lutheranism in a moment also. I also wish to talk about some different assumptions we make and to think about those. The first two are very simple, and one is that Lutheran, for me, I think needs to be an adjective, not a noun. For we are Lutheran Christians, and that goes also for the Methodists, the Baptists, the Roman Catholics, that they are Christians, and it is an adjective. Because after all, it isn't our denomination that saves us, but Christ that saves us. And then the other assumption that sometimes gets confused, or a point of confusion, is Martin Luther is not Martin Luther King Jr. And for those who are Lutheran, we know that. But for others, we have to explain that. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. came by his name appropriately from his father, and certainly his father was to be honored also for picking that name of a reformer and purposely giving that to his son and grandson, who would be preachers and also reformers of a nonviolent movement. Anyway, there we are. Now, I need to go back to some Reformation things. The Reformation happened in 1517. And if you add up years, that's almost 500 years. Now, I got confused because I could do arithmetic, and that means we're 498 years old. And there's all this talk about the 500th anniversary. So next year, when it's Reformation Sunday, it's a big thing because the powers that be, whoever they be, decided that that would be our year when we celebrate the 500th anniversary. I got this on a good resource from Laura. And indeed, it's a year-long celebration, and it culminates or ends at 1517 Reformation Day. If we remember that day, just quick history lesson, and I'm not the best history person, this was the day, or actually, it was All Saints' Eve, Hallowed Eve. If you really want to put that together, that's Halloween, was the day Martin Luther went to the Wittenberg Church, tacked his big 95 complaints about the Roman Catholic Church then, and put them on the door, and his items were for discussion and disagreement with the Pope and the Church, 95 of them. Now, I'm not a historian, and those were not the best of times for the Roman Catholic Church. And indeed, if we go back to that 1500 time and that time, it was a time of unrest and great change in the world. Simple history says 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and it was a world of exploration, and new worlds were being discovered where they weren't even thought to be. And indeed, it was, depending on your historians, the age of beginning of the Enlightenment, or it was going on. And the printing press was also invented. And that means that instead of the scribes writing it or the monks, things could be printed and read by people and the masses. Hard to believe way back then, 500 years ago. Now, once again, I'm not a historian, but some historians would say that our present time, the time of kind of unrest and change, is very similar to that time of the Reformation 500 years ago. And indeed, what do we see? We see a change with fantastic technology and a cyber age and an information age when we don't even know what to do with all that information. And we don't even know quite what to do and how to discern from the gospel lesson what is the truth. because there is so much information. And indeed, the etiquette of our cell phones and computers and all of that and our use, we don't even know how we should best use those yet. And I don't like it because I'm a senior citizen. But just like the Reformation times, it may take a lifetime for people to sort that out. And that's okay. Now as I come to you, I come from serving 2 Lutheran churches in southeastern Kentucky, Somerset and Russell Springs. So I have to bring a different flavor of things too, because I wanted to just talk a moment about our Lutheran presence in Kentucky. Lexington has several Lutheran churches, so at least the Lutheran name isn't unfamiliar. And other than here, there's an ELC church in Richmond, Pastor Barry, Russell Springs, and Somerset. And if you want to go any further, you have to go to Knoxville. Now, if we include the Missouri Synod, there are a few more in Lexington. There is one in Winchester. There's a small one in Danville. There was one south of Danville near Stanford, up that hill, and Ottenheim. However, that was a good old German Lutheran church, and the cemetery still exists, and the church is a museum. And maybe there's a lesson for us there on Reformation. And there's also, I believe, a preaching point in Hazard, and Bowling Green has a big Missouri church with an education school. But Lutherans are not a prominent denomination, and indeed, I have found that in my time, I've served in congregations or places where Lutherans were a majority religion, South Dakota and rural Northwest Ohio. And I've served where there were enough Lutheran churches in bigger cities that there was no identity problem. And even as I travel now as a retired pastor, even in Lexington, there are people who say, well, what's that Lutheran church all about? And certainly in the hinterlands down south, people travel 45 minutes at times just to find a Lutheran church. And it's not like they've passed others. Now, what I have discovered is I think when we Lutherans are a minority denomination, we know better who we are and are stronger for it. And I believe that's important. I've had to, in my growing up years in Washington, D.C., explain to the Catholics or argue with them over why we weren't condemned and they were the chosen ones. And, it's gone full circle. Now that I'm in the Bible Belt, it's been kinder, however. People in the Bible Belt are sometimes kinder. And it's more explaining who we are and explaining a church year and liturgy and Advent and Lent and those kinds of things. But it's important to know who we are as Lutherans. And now, I have, you got me on a Sunday where the Lutheran shows and you get a whole bunch of stuff. 3 assumptions that I think we make, and I'm not sure where they come from, but are there and teach us something about the Reformation. And I like to use either stories or images because I think they help most of all. And back when cigarettes were able to be advertised, there was that Marlboro man that maybe you remember, and he's still on some billboards and signs someplace. He was just the most dashing, virile, cool, debonair, free and independent man as projected on that image, who of course smoked Marlboros, but that's okay. But that picture of total independence is something I think we long for. And it was the hook to get you to their cigarettes or whatever. But indeed, that independence is something we want. And indeed, in my Lutheran heritage, I value some of that independence of freedom. Freedom from the canon law of the Catholic Church, and freedom from some of the Southern Bible Belt's do's and don'ts. And with that freedom, we're free as Lutherans to ask questions, to be curious, in fact, those questions and curiosity are appreciated and more than often encouraged. And yet, some folks, I think, it's not simpler to do it that way, but I think it's good. And some folks really don't want that. They want to be told what to do and then not have to think. And it's much easier that way, if you will. That freedom does come, not just complete freedom, but freedom with responsibility. Responsibility to do what is right. And the assumption can be that we're free. But even Jesus said, the freest of all is the servant of all. I appreciate that freedom. You know, it's harder that way. And I thought about John Calipari. You know, he said, UK basketball is not for everyone. He's talking about players. You know, it's for every fan, of course. But Lutheran Christianity may not be for everyone because it's not necessarily the easiest way. That's one of three. 3 years is all you get on these things. I'm going to breathe a minute. The second assumption, and I don't know where it comes from. Maybe it comes from my cartoon days, or maybe it even comes from Sigmund Freud. But it's the scoreboard idea of right and wrong. You know, there's that little angel on one side and that devil with the pitchfork on the other, and you've got a scoreboard up there. And somehow or another, you're counting up all the good deeds on one side and the not so good, bad things on the other. And you hope that indeed you can get more on the good side than the bad side. And then you should be all right. But if we think about it, this was Martin Luther's problem too as a student and part of those 95 complaints. He couldn't do enough to please God. And we can't either. Indeed, if we do the scoreboard thing, it only takes one on the bad side, and we're guilty. What can we say? But the answer comes from our text in Romans today. And it comes that we are justified not by works of the law, by the things we do, because we can never do enough. But we are justified by faith and God's grace. And I can tell you that God's grace is the best good news in the Southern Bible Belt of all. And it resonates and is appreciated by so many over just judgment. Grace. God's amazing grace, overwhelming, overflowing, even transforming, and challenging us to reach more of our potential. In the news, watching the news a couple weeks ago, our dear Rowan County clerk was on. And she said something that just hit me like a brick. She said, God hates me for what's going on. And I said, theologically speaking, that's all wrong. And then I thought about it some more and said, you know, she's right where Martin Luther was. How can I please God? And indeed, God hates sin, but still loves the sinner. And that's graceful news for all of us, because we fall in that category. Okay, that's 2 down, so we're moving right along. We're okay. The last assumption. The Reformation was an event that happened almost 500 years ago, and it's a history thing. Instead, being reformed daily is the whole message of Reformation. And it's an ongoing process that I think we can never outgrow. For Luther, the key is to remember and relive your baptism daily, because that's the key. We are dying to sin and rising to new life. So when you wash your face, take a shower, In a way, remember your baptism, the water, and its cleansing and renewing, and the dirt is going away. Or whether it's daily confession in our prayers and forgiveness. It's also in our liturgy, the confession and forgiveness. There's a rhythm to that reformation in our Lutheran Christianity and worship that I think is very important. Dying to self, rising to new life, self-sacrifice, and being transformed to a new potential. And you know, when I find down south those Bible Belt Baptists who talk about baptism so much, I almost, if the conversation has gone well, I almost want to tell them, and sometimes have, that I think in a way we emphasize our baptism, if we take it seriously and relive it, even more than you do who remember a date and a time. And as long as I'm talking about that, there's just one more sentence. I think the difference between a child's baptism and an older believer's baptism is our emphasis. Our emphasis on the child in baptizing is on grace, God's action coming down to us. And the other is really a response to God's love, of course. But it's important that to be baptized, you have the response. And if I had to pick and choose, I would choose, of course, my Lutheran bias. Well, that leads, I think, to where I wanted to go for the finish. And if we are a Reformation church, this would have been my children's sermon. So if we are a Reformation church, being reformed and being, renewed, are we a church of modeling clay, or are we a church of Play-Doh? And the kids took over and brought, where'd he go? Oh, he's way back there. Okay, brought Onward out, and that was beautiful. So they got me to use it as an adult children's sermon part for the finish. A church of modeling clay or Play-Doh. Both can be molded in our hands and formed and worked until they're just the way we want them. Reformed again and again until just the way the object should be. But what happens then? You know, their Play-Doh dries out, is useless and done. Gone, sort of, rigid. Modeling clay dries and gets hard, and it's not always easy, but it can be remolded with a lot of work and care and moisture and whatever it takes there to be remolded into something new or adapted. And indeed, as a Reformation church, not just looking at a past event, but looking at living in our baptisms, what kind of church are we? To that I simply say, amen.